Hi, everyone. Welcome to the research showcase for June 2022. My name is Martin Gerlach. I'm a research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I have the pleasure to be the host for today's showcase. The theme revolves around Wikipedia's languages. That's extremely important in the context of the movement's commitment to knowledge equity. Perhaps the first and largest Wikipedia that we know is the English language version of Wikipedia, but now there are more than 300 different language versions. However, there's still a large focus on the English version, English Wikipedia, in many of the research publications. And only recently, there have been more and more efforts by researchers to expand to be more multilingual, cover other language editions, but also to be more multimodal to capture content in terms of images or other content from other Wikimedia projects. The research team, our team, has been working in this direction as part of the Address Knowledge Gaps program, for example, by developing models that are language agnostic, so they can support as many language projects as possible. We have written up some of our thoughts behind this. If you're interested in a recent paper describing some considerations for multilingual Wikipedia research, I will share the link in the chat in 1 minute if you want to read up. But with this in mind, it's clear that we need to better understand the diversity of languages in Wikipedia and beyond. And for this, I'm really excited about today's speakers that will tell us about their research in this direction. First, we have Jizong Yoon, graduate student in the Complexity in Social Systems lab at the Pohang University of Science and Technology in South Korea. He'll talk about quantifying knowledge synchronization in the 21st century, where he explores paths of knowledge diffusion at the example of Wikipedia. And in the second half, we have Martin Ditus, a digital geographer and data scientist previously at Oxford Internet Institute, and he will be presenting about the language geography of Wikipedia. That is research that was conducted as part of the report on the state of the internet's languages produced by Whose Knowledge. We also have Mariana from Whose Knowledge here in the room with us for the Q&A. So we're glad that she joins us here too. Please ask questions for her too. I want to thank both of the speakers and Mariana for joining us here. Thanks for taking the time and sharing your research. I'm very excited. The last point I want to make is at the end of each talk, we have time for Q&A. So if you have questions, put them in the chat on IRC or on YouTube, and Diego will monitor the questions and relay them here. And with this, I'll pass it to Jisung for your presentation.
Yeah, so let me share the screen. So can you see my screen now?
Yes, this works.
Yeah. So hi, my name is Jisong Yoon, and I'm a graduate student in Pohang University of Science and Technology. And today I'm talking about the knowledge synchronizations in the 21st century using the Wikipedia dataset. So let's talk about the knowledge. So knowledge, according to the definition of the Wikipedia, knowledge is the understanding of the subject, which is acquired through the experience and educations, and also concept that human understanding is from the early experience. So actually, experience itself is different by the individuals or language group or etc. So therefore, another interest research on this kind of the concept, which means that like human conventionally acquire information through the language. So inevitably, language and knowledge structure, knowledge like interact in each other. So knowledge structure is also like another like more complex concept of the knowledge. So knowledge structure is the like relation between the knowledge about the particular topics. And we can think of this kind of simple example. So mathematics is belong to like algebra, and number theory belong to mathematics. And we can think this kind of the like hierarchical concept between the knowledge. And we can encode this kind of concept with the network. And in this network, each node is kind of the knowledge concept. And like link between the two concepts is kind of the hierarchical or relation between the two concepts. And this is also example, like interesting example on the real Wikipedia, and which evidence like ranking definitely affect the knowledge itself. And according to English Wikipedia, they like pancake like they define the crepe as a thin pancake, but French Wikipedia define the pancake as a thin thick crepe. And as we can like the difficult people, knowledge structure can be varied by personality, or living country, or ranking profile based on the social structure and education system. And based on this kind of evidence, we already know that knowledge structure can be different by the language group, but humankind like try to like interaction each other, and they like knowledge they connect their knowledge based on the roots, and which is called the knowledge transfer in some sense. And we can think of the knowledge transfer as a fake road. The fake road is kind of the like connection between the Far East to the to Europe, and this kind of the movement of people and good resulting in the transmission and exchange of the knowledge based on the like this kind of knowledge and idea belief over the 3 millennia. And also we can think of the what if the like modern fake road of the knowledge figurations and the Telephone paper on the education field, and they said that soft power movement between the like groups is the 20th century of the fake road. So based on this kind of the like findings, we can our in this study we will try to answer 2 questions. So first question is that if the knowledge structure is different by the language usage group, then does the social interaction improve the structure of the human knowledge? And if the answer is yes, and what is the main contemporary channel for knowledge distributions? So does it combine the geographical like barrier in the like left side of the this figure, or does it on the like online based ways? So this is the like our main question on the this research, and in this research we try to find the what if the contemporary fake road in the 21st century. So if we want to construct the knowledge structure of a specific group, but this like problem is tricky because of the if you think about the what if the knowledge database and represent example of the knowledge database, the paper or patent. But this kind of data is not proper to construct knowledge structure of a specific group, or especially for a specific language usage group. For this point, we use the Wikipedia dataset, and Wikipedia is the knowledge database emerged from the collaboration of many individuals who use specific language. So based on this kind of concept, we construct the knowledge structure per each language usage group, and we compare 2 different language groups from this kind of the point. So left side is the example of the English Wikipedia. If we like search the complex system in the Wikipedia, we can easily like capture this kind of results. And results says that complex system belong to the complex dynamics or cybernetics, emergence, etc. But if you go to the French Wikipedia, they also make some this kind of relation in the Wikipedia dataset. But interesting point of this kind of example is that, like in French Wikipedia, they consider complex system as a more sociological concept because of the you can easily like feed this kind of the concept from the sociological concept. So therefore, they have a very similar point. Also, they have a very different point. Then how can you like quantify this kind of the relationships? So for this point, we use the like personal page rank algorithm. So we quantify surrounding context of given subject with the PPR algorithm. So this is the one kind of example for our result. So if we calculate the complex system for English Wikipedia database, and we can also like equivalent concept in the French Wikipedia dataset, then we can compare this kind of 2 different concepts from 2 knowledge database for language linked dataset in Wikipedia. Then we can calculate the similarity between the complex system and the equal document in the French Wikipedia. And we define the similarity between the 2 knowledge structure at the average value of the all subject similarity between 2 languages, and then resulting in the like one measure for 2 different language groups. And in this research, we use the 59 language edition from the Wikipedia dataset, And we collect all the like knowledge structure for each group, and we quantify similarity between the like 50 among the 59 language with each group. And this is our first finding. The first finding is that geographical proximity is still better, but socio-economic interaction shape the knowledge structure. For left 5, the result our like similarity metric for the aforementioned the similarity measure. And based on this network, we conduct the clustering algorithm based on that, and we find 5 clusters. And if we map this kind of cluster on the geographic space, we can easily get the right side of the figures. And for the cluster 2, we can see that like both the language, like home center of the Western Europe and cluster 4, we can easily see that those Eastern Europe, and cluster 4, this is the Southeast Asia. So which means that geographical proximity affects the similarity of the knowledge structure across language user group. But if we go to the like result of the cluster 1, the geographic distance is a little bit tricky because of they span all around the world, and which means that geographic property is still improved, but another like interaction shape the knowledge structures. And they resulting in the like further analysis on this. And in this plot, y-axis is the similarity between the 2 language groups, and x-axis is the socio-economic interaction between the 2 language groups. So we can say that geographic distance between the like correlation between the geographical distance and similarity is very, very low, with the 0.01 something. But if we go to the upper, go to the socio-economic interaction, the like coefficient between the 2 data is very, very high. So for the effort, the data is the point 0.1 or something like that. But we find that degree of the offensive between the socio-economic interaction and the knowledge structure to occur in the following order. The most wicked form the geographic distance and expert, and next is the number of the like paper citation between the 2 language groups. And another, the next thing is the soft power movement, which means that like number of the interest between the 2 language groups, and the most like strongest way is the strong knowledge dissemination, which means that actual paper collide between the 2 language groups. And final thing is the mutual friendship on the web. This is like very intuitive result because of the expert is not all about the like knowledge transfer, but number of citations, the number of collaboration is all about the knowledge like structure. So this result is like much more makes sense. And another like aspect of the result is that like if the language relative is better for this kind of results. So because of if the 2 languages like belong to the 1 language family, then much more like easier to run the language, and that resulting in the similarity in the knowledge structures. And we also examine this kind of concept with the data set, but the incremental, like the increment, like how to say, amount of increment is very incremental, and like just 0.3 or something like that. And suggesting if you go to the result of the integer student and pay for SI, and the increment is very subtle, which means that integer student or paper SI may already include this kind of the ranking rate already in their data set. So up to now, we can say that geographic property is still improved, but the socio-economic interaction shape the knowledge structures. So up to now, our empirical analysis reveals that knowledge structure are more likely to be similar if the interaction exists between the language groups, and the degree of the efficient knowledge structure vary based on the type of interactions. Well, based on the 2 kinds of empirical analysis, we build a mechanic model for the better understanding of what caused the knowledge synchronization between the 2 groups. So we build a model which is motivated by chromatin model. Actually, this chromatin model is motivated like for explaining the synchronization between the synchronization phenomena in the fireflies. So for each time t, each agent like select one of their neighborhood, so we can easily check the right side. This is the real example of our mechanic model. So each time t, each agent select one of the neighborhood to like based on the probability of the given proximity. For each model, we can use another proximity. For instance, we can use the geographical proximity as a proximity measure, or another model, we can use the number of the citation between the 2 groups using the citation number of the citation between the 2 groups. So as shown in the example, the English agent choose the French agent as a neighbor for synchronization, So as the time goes by, everyone's more likely to similar, and actually, like at the time t0, they are randomly initialized because of the we assume that they start with the very random point in our models. So this is our real example from the data set. So right side is the empirical knowledge structure similarity from the Wikipedia data set, and left side our result from our mechanic models. Because we can see that scales are a little bit different, but we can check that the like overall pattern is very, very similar. So we quantify this kind of similarity with the Pearson correlation between the best model similarity and empirical knowledge similarity, indicate how well each proximity can reproduce the empirical knowledge of similarities. And we can see that we found a very similar inclusive patterns of the observation with our empirical observation above. So specifically, we observed that lowest Pearson correlation for the geographical distance, and this is very confused with our empirical finding, and followed by the amount of effort and the paper collaboration, public paper citation number, and the public collaborator numbers, which means that our model is the simplistic replica using only a simple root of exchange, but implies that social interaction can shape the structure of the human knowledge. So summary, we use the Wikipedia data set to evaluate the similarity of knowledge structure from different language groups. And we evaluate this kind of using the knowledge similarity with the network representations. And we discovered a very plausible modular structure of the language usage groups, and found that cooperative scientific research and social tie actually can explain the synchronization of the knowledge structure rather than geographical proximities. And furthermore, we made a mechanic model to explain the knowledge, synchronization concept between the two knowledge structures, and we can introduce the potential mechanism underlying synchronization of the knowledge structures, and this is very similar to the synchronization between the fireflies. So thanks for the listening, and this is the collaboration, and thanks for the Wikipedia Foundation for operating this awesome data for our research. And this is the preprint version of our paper. And if you want to have a more information of our paper, you can easily read the paper on the archive. So thanks for the attention. And if you have any questions, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jisung, for the presentation. You're perfectly on time, so we have ample of opportunity for questions in the audience. If you have questions for Jisung, post them in the chat. We'll relay them here. If there are no so far, we can start here in the room. Maybe, Jisung, you want to stop sharing the screen? Then it's easier to follow who is speaking. Hey, so I'll pass it to the room. If you have a question, feel free to unmute. Martin, you are raising your hand. Go for it.
Yes, well, thanks so much. It's been fascinating to listen to this, and as everybody will see in about 20 minutes time, we actually have our research is very complementary in that we have a very different approach and a very different set of questions, but there are many places in which we end up looking at a related set of concerns. And one of the things that really struck me about the work and the question you're looking at is that language is also an important bridge. It's something that brings cultures together and that allows cultures, potentially quite different cultures, to share knowledge, to share information, and so on. And I thought that was the statistical approach and the empirical approach you pursued by also comparing Facebook structures to information structures on Wikipedia and so on, to make those comparisons. I thought that was really powerful. I have a simple technical question just about your approach. I'm curious about the source of your data. Specifically, did you use Wikidata when you constructed your model as a source of information? And if so, do you have any recommendations for researchers about how to approach that and how to work with Wikidata? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So actually, like Wikipedia is very have a very good quality because of we can easily download from the dump.wikipedia or some things. And actually, like for this data, like for this research, we use the two specific how to say kind of the data set. First is the category link data set, and second is for language link data set. Language link data itself is very interesting because of they manually connect from the equivalent document but the different concept in the data set. And actually this data is very interesting data to how to say explain more about that. But the one thing that I want to say is that document itself is a little bit complicated for the non-technical person because of they build some kind of the ERD for some specific bit, but I think it's hard to follow for the non-technical person. So it is more better for easily how to say. I think the easy document for non-technical person also needed for the further further available data set. But besides that, our data itself is very excellent, and I'd like to more conduct for another research based on this kind of data set.
Thank you. That's very interesting to hear, and also that absolutely corresponds with our experiences as well. So one thing we found in our Wikipedia research and in research of similar platforms is that's interdisciplinary teams can do really well, where you have both very technical people and people who have expertise in different disciplines and working together on a project. Because as you say, sometimes these engineering questions about how to work with the data, they become important enablers for us to then be able to ask those kinds of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Miriam, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the work. This is super interesting. I am very passionate about seeing this multilingual and multicultural work. So thank you so much, both of you already, Martina as well, for working on this. I have a question about something for which we had trouble in the past, and as a follow-up to Martin's question, which is mapping languages to geographical regions. So it hasn't been always easy for us to have an immediate mapping between languages and countries, because some languages are spoken into subregions of some languages that are spoken into subregions of countries. And so I was wondering if you can share a little bit more how you work on this mapping, if there is data on Wikidata, if you've found proprietary data, which I know it exists. I'm just wondering how you explore that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So actually, Wikipedia itself have different language editions, and for mapping language to country data set or mapping the country to language data set, it's very tricky to mapping those data set because their dimensions are a little bit different. So in specific research, we use another data set, language data set. So we actually mapping this kind of the concept with the language usage data set. For instance, in South Korea, we only use the South Korean in our data. But if you think about the United States and 80% use the English, but 20% use the Spanish or something like that. So for the differentiation, we manually collect that kind of the static for the result, but it is more easier to the project result more easily because of the actual Wikipedia also have some kind of the office log of the where do they from or where do they affect from, something like that. I think it is more easier to how to say provide this data more easily to the researchers, then it could be very beneficial to researchers, I guess.
Yeah, and maybe just add to that. I love this question, Miriam, because it goes straight to the heart of the complexity and the challenge of doing this work properly. And once you go down that road, you find that the world is not easily quantified. And you can do all kinds of fancy things, but ultimately you will always run into challenges like this one. One thing we learned from presenting the work that I'm about to show in a bit is that whenever we present work talks about a particular language culture, a particular world and a region in the world, someone in the audience will raise their hand and say, "I'm from there. You've completely misrepresented our experience." So the general point here is, it's impossible to do this perfectly. So it's always a matter of deciding what's compromises, what kind of caveats are you willing to work with, and then stating that upfront. We tried to work with Jisung mentioned they made specific choices about specific places, and that's always a good approach. But once you're trying to construct global models, you run into the limits about how much you can reasonably know about specific places. So we in our work, also some of that we'll show later. We used a Unicode. I'm sorry. We use a Unicode dataset. I just looked it up. It's called Language Territory Information, or CLDR is the name of the project. You can find it. It's an open dataset, and it speaks. Basically, it tries to estimate what population percentage in for every country speaks which languages. And that's one data set that is easily available and useful for this kind of research, but it has all the limitations of trying to quantify human experience. Most importantly, it's more reliable for certain places in the world than for others. And when you're trying to construct global models, that's a major caveat, because suddenly your model works for some places better than for other places in the world. And it's really hard to know that if you're not from those places. So it's a great question. And it's, yeah, thank you for asking.
Thank you for the sharing the links. So yeah, I think this is very interesting. Yeah, I can use different data for the further research. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Jisung, I think we still have time, so please have a few more minutes. We can take one or two more questions. In the meantime, I have a question, Jisung. First, thanks for the great presentation. Super interesting to see this social relatedness, how much this plays a role. My question is around whether you have looked into some of the causes behind it and like of some of the findings that you saw. For what I'm thinking of is one that you showed the similarity, but did you see some signs kind of in terms of when I think of dissemination, that there is a direction in which kind of maybe which language influences the other language stronger, so that the structure becomes similar, perhaps? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And the second part would be around what could that influence be around, and you mentioned this Facebook graph, but if you have any, if you did any analysis around, for example, bilingual speakers, so that could translate certain articles. And we know there's a very successful translation tool developed by the Wikimedia Foundation that has, I think, translated more than 1 million articles. So I wonder if these are probably bilingual speakers, or at least have an understanding. So how that could add into kind of making some structures more similar than others. So curious to hear if you have any thoughts on these two aspects.
Yeah, for the first question, so you mentioned that if there you wonder that there's a kind of the directionality, like information direction between the language groups. So actually, we observed that kind of things in our in our mechanical model. So in the paper, we saw that more specifically, we use the OECD statistic for the integration of students between the groups. But OECD data only cover the student from the for a student to two advanced countries, which means that statistics into student is very asymmetry because of the many other country student in the country go to the United States, but reverse way is not exist, rarely exist. So maybe directional affect the result, but you don't have any kind of the clear answer to that. But for sure, maybe that should be improve the similarity between the two language groups. And for the second question, you mentioned that bilingual person can easily translate the knowledge to their another group. And actually, there's some another research on this kind of concept, if the one user can use the multi-language, then they're more likely to similar in the language from specific interest spaces in the previous research, and that could be the result. But we don't consider that kind of things in the result because we don't have any kind of the statistics of each user in our data set. So we only consider knowledge structure between the two groups.
Thank you. Any last questions we should add now? I'll count to 3. And if that's not the case, I think we can, if there's something that comes up, we can revisit later. Thank you, Jisung, for the talk. And now we switch to the second part. Martin, please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, for inviting us to speak here. We are great fans of Wikipedia as a platform, as a community, as a movement. Wikipedia is a major human achievement. It's a historic project, I always like pointing that out because part of our work is also to scrutinize Wikipedia and to try and also find some of the tensions that are part of Wikipedia. But I think whenever we do that, it's also important to say we are in awe of what Wikipedia represents. Sorry, I just accidentally clicked. So we are here to talk about a project whose knowledge is a nonprofit organization that engages with questions about online justice and online marginalization. They come out of the Wikipedia movement, and they do a lot of work with Wikipedia as well as with other platforms. And a few years ago, they suggested it might be worthwhile to create a report on the state of the internet's languages. And I'll tell you in a bit why we think that's a great idea. And the work I'm about to show, that this comes out of that project and out of this report. The report is now published. The work I'm about to present is about the language geography of Wikipedia. The report is publicly available for free. internetslanguages.org is the place to go to, and you will find a rich spectrum of data sets, reports, empirical investigations, as well as storytelling about people's experiences of the internet from different places in the world, from the perspective of different language speakers. Why did Whose Knowledge suggest to focus on language specifically in this report? Well, so I suspect many on the call here speak at least 2 languages, maybe more. I'm German. I grew up in Germany. I've been living in an English-speaking country for 20 years. There are certainly places in the world where it's very common to speak more than one language, just naturally as part of being in a place. And people who have made those experiences, and people who speak different languages, they will know exactly how different it can feel to speak a different language, and how even a different language can make you think differently. How also language sometimes is specific languages you might use for certain things, and other languages you might use for others. So for many people, maybe there's a language you use at work and the language you use to speak with your family, and so on. There are places in the world where language is an important aspect of your tradition. So for example, if we look at the global context, there are many places where maybe the official language is a historically colonial language. English is part of that. Spanish and other languages are part of that, where it can be very important to have certain knowledge be captured in your own indigenous, in your historic language, when you're trying to capture your traditions and so on. It might be of fundamental importance to do that in your original languages, because words might change meaning once you translate them. This is why we're interested in looking at language online. The question we are basically asking is, how much of the rich diversity of the world's languages is available online. There are about 7,000 languages spoken today. For us Europeans, that's easy to forget. We think of the world maybe in a dozen languages, or maybe I should say I, as a European, when I was young, maybe thought about the world in terms of a dozen languages, and I had no conception of that level of language diversity. So this is what we did basically. With this was the motivation for the report. As I said, it's a rich source of information. Loads of stories across different global experiences, data sets, and so on. And I invite you all to check it out. Just before I jump to the Wikipedia part, just at a very high level, what we learned from the work as a whole is maybe not surprising these days. The internet is not as multilingual as we might expect. A lot of the online platforms that people use are predominantly using a small number of languages like English, like Mandarin Chinese. Arabic tends to be very well supported, but many languages don't tend to be as prominent online. And I'll show you some examples in the Wikipedia context in a bit. So let's talk about Wikipedia. As we all know, Wikipedia supports a lot of languages. It's on the order of 300 languages these days. Started as an English language project, very quickly grew into a highly multilingual project. And we should also say, since we've now looked at the numbers and we've looked at different online platforms, Wikipedia is at the forefront of global language support. Very few other platforms even try to support that many languages. And largely it's well-funded organizations like Facebook and like Google who can afford to try that. But most projects are nowhere near that. So again, Wikipedia, remarkable achievement. As has been mentioned, in English Wikipedia certainly has comprehensive coverage. There's a lot of information that's already in there. There are also many gaps, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but there are certainly a lot of information in Wikipedia. However, even if we look at it at this high level, how much information is available in which languages in Wikipedia, you can see this chart on the right where we are comparing the number of Wikipedia articles in a language edition of Wikipedia compared to the number of speakers of that particular language. And then we can see for English Wikipedia, they line up, this lines up quite well. For Mandarin Chinese already, this might be very well known in the Wikipedia community. There's very little Mandarin Chinese content on Wikipedia. It's spoken by more than 1 billion people, but there's comparatively little content. There's all kinds of reasons, and we'll go into that in a bit. And Mandarin Chinese or Chinese in general is always a specific case. However, maybe more surprisingly, languages like Hindi and Bengali, which again are spoken by about 1 billion people together, that there's a significant language community there in India, but also around the world, who speak Hindi or speak Bengali as a first language. And there is very little Wikipedia content in these languages. So we see here, it's basically speakers of Bengali, of Hindi, are many might also be able to speak English, so that they can use the English Wikipedia instead. But chances are they won't find most information, they won't find in their own language. Wikipedia also talks about places and about geography. As I said earlier, our project is about language geography. This is the geography part. This here is a random castle in West Germany. When Wikipedia writes about places in the world, there's often, on the page, you see geographic coordinates mentioned. We use this as a data point to try and find out which places in the world are written about in Wikipedia. Now, if we put these two things together, the languages of Wikipedia and the geography of Wikipedia, we can make maps like this. This is a representation of the geography of content for English Wikipedia. These are all the places in the world that have articles on Wikipedia. And the color gets darker if there's more content available for these places. And the first thing we should observe Wikipedia, the achievement or the aspiration of the aim of Wikipedia is to capture the world's knowledge and to describe all of the world. Arguably, that is sort of taking place. Many of the places in the world are written about. There are some gaps, but maybe that's those are places in the world where there's less human activity, and certainly places where people live tend to be covered in English Wikipedia. The second thing we should notice, however, is also this is a highly unequal coverage. There's a lot of content about Europe, about North America, about certain parts in West and South Asia, but many other parts of the world are not as well covered on English Wikipedia. Now, if we look at this for other language editions, it's even more severe. We can see that, I keep clicking. We can see that Arabic Wikipedia seems to have a sort of similar coverage as English Wikipedia, just with less content. But again, when we look at the distribution of Bengali content, in Hindi, that is largely focused on places where Bengali speakers and Hindi speakers predominantly live, but there's very little content about other places in the world. And with Spanish, again, we see this very characteristic distribution. Wherever Spanish speakers live, that's where we also see a lot of Wikipedia content. That's something that's very interesting to observe. So it's kind of the language communities maybe satisfying their own needs and describing their own world. That's a good thing. And the question maybe for Wikipedia is, do we want content about Brazil in Bengali? How is that something that we want to achieve? But overall, just to kind of summarize that, we do see there's highly unequal language coverage. Certain languages are more well covered on Wikipedia than others. There's highly unequal geographic coverage as well. And to taken together, we can say there is on Wikipedia, there is a highly unequal language geography. That's not necessarily bad in itself. That's simply something we can observe for now. But I'll come back to that question for a bit. And this is maybe where it becomes important. So this is a more complex map. So I'll explain. I'll try to explain what we're doing here. Basically, we ask this question: if not every part of the world is written about in every language, which might be fine. Is it still the case that places are described in their own languages? So if we pick a random place in South America, in Western Europe, in Southeast Asia, are those places described in their own languages? And so this map tries to express that. So using this data set we mentioned earlier, the Unicode CLDR, we try to understand, first of all, which languages are spoken in which places in the world. And there are limitations for that, but it's a first estimate. And then we compared that with the amount of Wikipedia content that is available in those languages about those places. And this map here then categorizes them. Everything in this color, in orange, expresses places where most of the content is available in a local language. And everything in this blue color, in this shade, describes places in the world where most of the content about these places is actually written in a foreign language. It's not a language that is either a national language or widely spoken in these places. Often that is English. English is widely spoken in many places of the world, but it's not typically the official language of all the places in the world. But there are also other languages that feature prominently. And I think this is something where we might want to ask, what are the effects of that? And when suddenly maybe you have a situation where your environment, your culture, your country, your communities, your places are described in a foreign language, does that also mean it's written from an outside perspective? And we don't always know this. Sometimes it's people living in these places writing in, for example, in English Wikipedia because it's the most widely used Wikipedia. But sometimes it's also simply people who live maybe somewhere else entirely in an effort to improve representation, to improve coverage on Wikipedia, writing about places that they haven't been to. And again, this might be a good thing, or it might be a challenging thing. On OpenStreetMap, there's discourse around what people call armchair mapping. On OpenStreetMap, there's a strong value in parts of their traditions that you should only be mapping places that you've visited. I think on OpenStreetMap these days, that has become a bit more complicated, and it's not necessarily the only view on how content should happen. On Wikipedia, it's even more complicated because Wikipedia as an encyclopedia by default is maybe written by people sitting in their chairs rather than being out in the world. So it's complicated, but as certainly we can see, there are many places in the world that might be written from an outside perspective, that might be written about, might be described from an outside perspective. And this is really the question we want to ask. When that happens, what are the perspectives, what are the experiences that are potentially not captured? One question, I'll just speed up a bit in the interest of time. But these are kind of the main points we wanted to raise and the main questions we want to ask. Of course, we then try and understand, so why is that? Why do we see these kinds of imbalances in coverage? And when you start looking at that, one aspect you certainly discover quickly, this is partially an imbalance in participation. This is the chart I'm showing here. This is now a few years old, and is something that's quickly changing, but we can certainly still say that connectivity is not easily available to everybody around the world. There are certain places in the world where a broadband subscription costs more than the monthly average income. And that's a major barrier to online participation. And this might be part of this. There's a second potential barrier, which is what academics call contribution norms or social norms on online platforms and so on. What that really means is how does Wikipedia or how do platforms like that expect that people contribute? And one thing that's really important on Wikipedia is this question of sourcing. You should not make original claims. Instead, you should always provide a source for major claims you're making in your contribution. Here's an example from a Wikipedia webpage about the Yanomami tribe. That's an indigenous tribe of the Amazon. And there's a phrase here where they talk about the marriage practice and the kind of family structures of the Yanomami tribe. And it ends in this beautiful tag that we're all very familiar with, citation needed. Now, from a Wikipedia quality standpoint, content quality standpoint, that's a really important tag. It allows us to distinguish things that just someone said and things that we think are true because they have been assessed and by a reputable source. Do also, I think this example in particular also makes us wonder, well, what kind of citation might we expect here? Do we think there is a reputable source that comes out of that community that can be cited on Wikipedia? Maybe not. Maybe the sources that are available in this case are actually, again, outside perspectives, maybe by a European anthropologist who in the 19th century traveled the Amazon and described what they saw from their European eyes. And maybe that is the only available source. So I think it's an important tag, and sourcing is important, but it also runs into these kinds of challenges. So there's research already a few years ago that looked at this. Are sources easily available for information about different places in the world? We don't have time to talk about the details here, but just in general, for many places in the world, it is a major challenge. That is a major challenge to improve coverage on Wikipedia. Martin earlier mentioned knowledge equity as a Wikipedia, as an important Wikipedia value. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but we really, our project with Whose Knowledge, and certainly I personally also, we really appreciate that this was identified as a value for the Wikipedia movement. And basically, the way I would express it, knowledge equity tries to say, we see it as fundamentally important that not only everybody has access to the same information, but also everybody gets to shape how they're being represented online. And sometimes when we want to make that happen, we need to deal with structural inequalities in order to make sure that representations are just, are fair, and are appropriate. And so I think that's a really important articulation for Wikipedia. And of course, we also all know there are now so many projects on Wikipedia that try and address systemic bias. There are hundreds of projects that are about specific issues, specific communities, specific places in the world, specific languages. That's really important. My colleague Mariana from Whose Knowledge is with us today, and if we have time during the Q&A, I would love to hear her tell us a little bit about work that she's doing and Whose Knowledge is doing around projects like Visible Wiki Women and other projects. And I think those are really important. That's in some ways, those projects are really, in my eyes, the future of Wikipedia. There's a similar concern about how can we make it possible that people contribute on Wikipedia. There's a bit of discourse that is happening in parts of the community around the fact that, well, maybe not everybody can afford, maybe not everybody has spare time. And maybe there is an argument to be had that some Wikipedia contributions, specifically when they're about addressing gaps in coverage, maybe those should be paid contributions. There's an article my co-author Mark Graham and I wrote a few years ago on Wired. Have a look at that. We thought that's also an important question to ask. In general, I'll stop it here. This the summary of the work for now. But I think in summary, we want to say these are all complex issues, and it's impossible to make general statements about the world, and it's also really hard to quantify all those things properly and so on. But we certainly see many indicators of inequalities and of imbalance, and some of them are part of what the world is, and that they're general justice issues that we might want to attack. But some of them are specifically about how we structure our projects. And as I say, Wikipedia is a remarkable human achievement, and it's important to acknowledge that. At the same time, I think it's also important to say, if we want to go even further, we might need to fundamentally rethink some of the things we're doing. And we might need to speak to people from outside of our movement in order to really understand what the challenges are. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this presentation. Very, very, very interesting presentation. And again, super on time. We have lots of time for Q&A. As a reminder for the audience, if you're watching now, and you have a question for Martin or Mariana or Jisung, put them in the chat. We're happy to relay them here. In the meantime, we can start in the room. If you have a question, chime in or raise your hand. I see Jizong raise the hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for the great presentation. So actually, I enjoyed your art. So I have a very specific question. So because of in Wikipedia, we have a high quality of the translator, from the language, but you said that we need to pay some editors who reduce the gap. So do you think that automatically translating can resolve the problems, or you should encourage the people encouraging the reduce the gap? Actually, for reduce the gap, you can run the translator, and that can resolve the problem. But how do you think about this?
That's a great question. And it touches right on all the challenges that are social challenges and sometimes political challenges. And I think I'm a computer scientist. I learned through work like this. Computer science and technology can be very important, but we also need to remember this is about human questions, and it needs to be solved by humans as well as through technology. And I think this is exactly one of those places technology can absolutely help, and machine translation can help. And I know that there are people very actively looking at that in the Wikipedia context. However, we also all know the limitations of machine translation. And so I think human involvement is always going to remain important in that, even if it's just about reviewing what the machine produced before it gets published, things like that. And again, OpenStreetMap is very actively looking at these kinds of things as well, where there's a kind of AI-based map making and so on, where the finding was also humans still need to be involved in that process in order to make it really good. And this payment one is an interesting one, and I think it's also an example of something where I don't think there's going to be one answer, and because it really depends on the context. It depends on maybe the place of the world we're talking about, or the type of gap or the type of imbalance we're trying to address. One of the, and then as you say, we can't expect just because someone gets paid that the content is automatically good. It won't be. We need to be really careful how we structure those kinds of arrangements. One of the models, so this article is now a few years old. I'm not entirely sure what has happened since then. But one of the models we really liked when we looked at that was the model of the Wikipedian in residence, which is an arrangement where someone is, where an existing cultural institution, often it's a museum or a gallery or a library, recruits someone to put their content, their cultural archive on Wikipedia. So where it's less about the voice of that individual person and their opinions and so on, it's more about making sure that knowledge that is already there but not on Wikipedia is captured in an appropriate way. There are still, I'm sure, many challenges in doing that properly, but that's one way of potentially doing it well. I'm also curious, Mariana, from your perspective, you dealt with these issues much more than me. What's your view on how we can improve coverage on Wikipedia?
Yes, I think that first, maybe I can highlight one of the whose knowledge most powerful idea about knowledge justice. For us, knowledge justice, we see knowledge justice as an extension of knowledge equity. And for us, it's not only about representation, but it's also about reparation. And I think that connect with your point, Martin, about paying or not paying contributors, because maybe that could be, and I know that this can be polemic for some Wikimedia community members. I know that, but if we look at the numbers and the stories we collected in the Internet Languages report, you will people can see that knowledge equity is not only about language representation in Wikipedia is very unproportional in relation with the population that speak a certain language. So there is something different. There is something that is not only about the numbers, but it's about or the proportions of speakers in a certain Wikipedia edition. Language edition is about power, it's about privilege, it's about a colonial and imperial story that is in the background of this unjust and uneven language and knowledge distribution. So if we think about that, if we think about it's not only about the proportion of languages represented or people represented, it's about very long-term processes of violence that affected cultures, language, the population that lives in and experience the world through those languages. I think that all that background can help us to open the discussion about who has the time to contribute, who has the language background to contribute or not, and the answer should include or not, because who is excluded and because what social processes of power and privilege is excluded is a very important question. And maybe I am bringing this here because I am not in computer science. I am a sociologist, so I have a social science background, and that kind of questions are part of our the kind of inquiry we do all the time about inequality, about justice. But I think that these data visualizations, data research, computer science can help us a lot to visualize that these inequalities actually have a background in power and privilege processes, because there is no proportion between the number of people that spoke a language and the number of contributions or the number of the knowledge you can find on Wikipedia. So I will stop here, but please, if you have more questions about this or comments or any topic to discuss, but I think that maybe we can think on how to bring editors in different languages through different strategies, including paying or supporting their time for contributing, is something that we can and we should consider from the point of view of reparation.
Thank you. Those are really important points. And I think also specifically for us as technologists, really important to consider. I'm 44. I'm part of a generation. I became an adult when the internet started to become really prominent. And for the longest time, I thought we're in a new moment in history where everything is new and everything becomes possible. And it took me 20 years to learn history is still there, has always been there. And it's on our shoulders, sometimes slowing us down because we need to carry it. So I think your point is really important, that when we look at these imbalances, it's really helpful to know those specific places that are underrepresented and know those histories and know those imbalances of access, imbalances of power, in order to really understand how can we improve things. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these perspectives. Diego, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all the speakers for a great presentation. I've been working in the past, kind of a side project. It's not my central work in the foundation, but in developing this Wiki Atlas. You can find it in wikiatlas.org, where we basically have maps where you can explore the content in different languages, and there's some classification. And one thing that we did there, and my question is related to that, is we use some topic models to classify the different kind of articles. And my question to you, I think Martin, but also Marianne, if you want to chime in, it's about if you have any qualitative analysis or intuition about which kind of content is shown in which kind of languages, depending on the relationship with this place and the language. So I could expect that, I don't know, in the Caribbean islands, you will have a lot of things related to the beaches there, things that people that will be tourists will be more interested probably, or there are things in some, there's a list of articles that's supposed to exist in all Wikipedias that are the most like basic encyclopedic articles, geography of the main cities, capitals. So that explains this coverage that you show in some places, Martin, because yeah, there will be an article about the capital of every country. This is something that you expect when you create a wiki. But do you have any other idea of what representation exists of those places, how it can affect like the way on how people think about a given place? It could be different if, I don't know, in Chile we have a lot of, I'm originally from Chile, we have a lot of poets, and I would expect a lot of articles about those poets, their poetry, and these kind of things. But maybe in Bengali Wikipedia, I need to be happy that we have an article about Santiago, because probably in Spanish Wikipedia we don't know a lot of the Bengali poetry or the Tamil poetry. So do you have any sense in terms of qualitative characteristic of the content?
Absolutely. There is research. If you check the publication history of Mark Graham, my co-author on this work, he's done a lot of work around the geography of Wikipedia, and some of it also relates to the participation geography of Wikipedia, where a few years ago, I don't remember the specific study, but they have looked at questions like that. But again, like the question Miriam asked earlier, you're asking a question, it's a fascinating question, but you're asking a question of about the complexity of the world. And there's not going to be one answer, but just from my memory, one thing that is observed in that kind of work is that, for example, in English Wikipedia, one of the reasons why American pop culture is really well covered is because it's consumed around the world, and you have contributors around the world enjoying that they are familiar with this and they can contribute. And they go specifically to English Wikipedia because it allows them to practice the language and celebrate their enjoyment of English language culture. This is one of the reasons why certain topics are for example, I don't know if the same happens with, did you say Chilean poets? I'm sure there is a person in Singapore who is really into Chilean poets, and they've contributed to Wikipedia articles about the Chilean poet. I'm sure that person exists, but it's not in this to the same degree as someone writing about American TV series and so on. So that's certainly something we find. The other we find is there might also just be political circumstance that limit contribution. So, for example, one of the reasons why Mandarin Chinese is really, everybody knows this in the community, why Mandarin Chinese is really underrepresented is partially their political and even legal barriers to participating in a project like that. So it really varies, and we almost need to look at every place in the world and their circumstance to really describe that. But as you say, that's exactly where qualitative work can provide very rich representative views. I don't know, Mariana, if you have things to add to that.
I don't have the data, but yes, I maybe I have some intuitions. I am familiar with those list of articles that should be in an encyclopedia, and I know that every Wikipedia edition has I don't know if every Wikipedia has one list, but I am familiar with that list, and but at the same time, what contributions a certain community does, is maybe it's more related what you are saying, Martin, the preferences, the things that the community enjoy or are more engaged. And I think that maybe we need to be critical about that, to not think that the preferences and the criteria of a specific part of the or specific communities in the world are representative of the preferences or the things that every other community or language community feels or thinks or experiment as relevant for their daily needs and their daily experience on Wikipedia. So I think that the gap, the participation gap, who is writing Wikipedia is very important. It's not only about the content, it's who is who is writing the content. That's why we raise questions about languages, about gender, about race and ethnicity, about origins, because oftenly we tend to misunderstand preferences or the core culture or the core of a the Western culture as the most universal, the must-have in relation with content. So and we need to be critical about that and reflect about that, because individual preferences are not necessarily are informed by a cultural background and by a social and economical background of injustice, inequality, and history of colonizations too. So when we do those lists, we need to have that in mind, and also we need to have in mind how rules around notability, around what encyclopedic content means, how oftenly a certain knowledge is misclassified as not notable or not relevant enough. So we need to think critically about all of that. And I think that in the past research showcase, there was a presentation about the gender gap that was related with the misclassification of women biographies as not notable, and then how some of them were restored to Wikipedia. And I think that we can use that that approach to other content. I think that to think on misclassifications, notability, criteria of relevance are very important to think about all of this, and the possible misrepresentation of some knowledge as not so relevant for this specific or that specific Wikipedia edition.
Absolutely. So many things going on in my head right now. This is really fascinating to it's really fascinating to listen to you, and it's really helpful to hear those perspectives. A few things to say about what you just said. You talked about the importance of enjoyment as a contributing factor on Wikipedia. I'm old enough to remember when Wikipedia started, and the rest of the world looking at Wikipedia thought it was ridiculous that people would spend their spare time on a project like this. And we're now on the other end, where everybody knows exactly that this is not only possible, it's incredibly valuable to structure a project like that. And I as a researcher, I spent time in the past looking at online participation, and there's a lot of work trying to understand what makes people participate in these kind of settings and so on. And Wikipedia introduced new theory about participation, where historically volunteering activities were about self-improvement, were about social experience and so on. And Wikipedia also has all that, but enjoyment is a major new theoretical element of participation that's really important to Wikipedia that hadn't been previously considered as important in volunteering settings. So the enjoyment of participation is an incredibly important aspect. But as you say, if that is a key driver, what are the things that are potentially not happening? And this is where other motivators and potential other enablers, like payment or even just, we don't even have to go all the way to payment, but even just identifying what makes contributions hard and removing those barriers can be incredibly important. Because maybe if you're already not, if you're already not entitled, well, anything, let's just say anything that removes enjoyment of participation is potentially a massive driver of gaps. So even small moments, small interactions, small bit of feedback that take away your enjoyment, they might have long follow-on effects. That's really important. And I think that's something that we're learning and have been learning in the last 20 years about online communities, how important it is to have constructive exchange, friendly feedback, to be supportive of other people's initiative, how incredibly important that is. And Wikipedia again has been at the forefront of this, but also because of the size of the project, has also had to suffer a lot of those kinds of tensions at incredible intensity, again in ways where it's really rare and kind of in human history to have that large number of people engaged in this very specific activity. We have still very little understanding about, we're starting to build understanding about how to do that well. But I think a lot of, and that's not, again, OpenStreetMap is very similar, other communities are very similar. Burnout, contributor burnout is very common under these kinds of circumstances. And if that affects certain groups more easily than others, that is certainly a potential key driver of imbalances. So those, let's call them, from a technology perspective, let's call them soft factors or human factors. They're actually very central to what we need to look at now. They're really important for the future of Wikipedia. The other thing I would want to say is, after having attended a few Wikipedia conferences and events and Wiki Arabia and other places like that, I do think Wikipedia is at the forefront of not only the scale of this kind of human initiative, but also let's call it the bureaucracy. That sounds negative. Let's say the question of organizing principles. And Wikipedia is really an innovator when it comes to this. And from attending these events, I started thinking of Wikipedia as the online UN, the online United Nations, in the sense that whenever I go to a Wikipedia conference or Wiki Arabia and events like that, I meet a lot of people who are incredibly delighted by ideas of global togetherness and global exchange and globally supporting each other. And it's an incredibly friendly community. And at the same time, also dealing with some hard questions and hard challenges. But I think Wikipedia is really, at the core of it is the enjoyment of the activity and the belief that this is something that should exist. And that's a great motivator. I think it's really helpful that Wikipedia is structured in different languages projects, which also allows it to have different organizing principles and different communities coming from different cultures, making their own choices about how to go about certain things. And we know that this is happening in Wikipedia. But yeah, as I said at the beginning, we're dealing with, at some point when you ask these questions, we're dealing with the complexities of the world. Increasingly, as I think it's helpful to think of it as political questions and cultural questions, as well as platform questions. How does the world talk to each other? How does the world make a decision when so many people are involved? Those are political questions. Those are questions about political organizing, because everybody will have different opinions and different perspectives.
Thank you. I have one more question, kind of, I think, to both of the speakers. And that, as you described, there's so many open questions, so that still need to be answered around the multilinguality and so on. And as you mentioned, it's difficult, right? Like doing this research on multiple languages, you described one aspect just around mapping regions to the language versions and so on. But I imagine there's many, many more. And I would like to ask for if you have thoughts that part of our mandate or what we do in the research team is to support the research community of Wikimedia researchers or researchers working on the Wikimedia projects. So from your experiences or the challenges that you encountered in an ideal world, let's say, what could you imagine? What would make it easier for you, or what you imagine for others to do similar types of multilingual research? I would be curious to hear your thoughts and ideas.
Jisung, would you like to go first? Mariana, also gather your thoughts. I'd be happy to.
You can go first.
Okay, when I did this research, I was in an employment arrangement where I was already funded. Otherwise, that is always the first question: how can research like this be funded? Later on, some of the funding came from Whose Knowledge. Whose Knowledge is a nonprofit. They made work like this possible, and they're an important enabler, not only in providing funding by asking great questions, by being actively connected to communities around the world, around issues of online participation, online justice, and so on. So organizations, Whose Knowledge specifically, but also organizations like Whose Knowledge are incredibly important in order to make sure that work like this happens, but it also in order to make sure that it happens well and that it's connected to the right places, it's asking the right questions, it's purposeful, and so on. So my first request would actually, if you're asking where should we focus our effort, I would say help us identify organizations like Whose Knowledge and make sure that they have what's needed, because they will then know what research they would want to see, and they will then know who needs to talk to who in order to make sure that that work happens well. But they might require funding of their own, or they might require other forms of support of their own. They will also always appreciate if we use our channels to highlight their work when they publish findings, when they structure new initiatives. Mariana, I still would love to hear you, if we have time, to hear you talk about some of the activities you're working on, or you've worked on as at Whose Knowledge. But for me, that's at the moment there's been a lot of let's call it kind of fundamental research on Wikipedia. Increasingly, it's less about Wikipedia as a whole, but more about specific issues around Wikipedia. And there we need to be grounded in specific contexts, in specific cultures, and so on. And organizations like Whose Knowledge are key to that.
Yeah. And I can go now. So actually, when I started my previous project, we start from like in our research, we use only 59 rank edition, but we've started 230 rank edition because of we collect the data from the dump data set. But actually, some of the wiki is not organized well. For instance, very minority language, Wikipedia minority is not organized well. So I think that as Dr. Martin said, the encouraging people to for especially the minor language users, how to say, promote the people to editing Wikipedia is very, very important because of the in other research I also using the Wikipedia dataset, and the thing that Wikipedia is a self-organized system, then participation is very important thing, and encouraging people to participate is quite important feature of the future study or future creation of the Wikipedia, I guess.
Thanks for your thoughts. If there's any final thoughts, Mariana, or anyone else wants to share, now's the moment before we wrap up.
Yes, so only to say thank you for this space and for the opportunity not only to talk about the research and the data and the challenges of research itself, but also as a space of political reflection around research, which is something that not all the time researchers and communities have the opportunity to do. And yes, and I just want to add, to extend the invitation to everybody to have a look on the Internet Languages report, because we have there, you can find there different ways in which you can engage with the this research, which we know it is still in progress, still in process, is incomplete. We need you, we need everybody to fully understand the realities of the different realities of people experimenting languages online and on Wikipedia. So please read the report, spread the report, have a look, and follow our invitations to continue researching and our call to actions, because you can be engaged as translators, as tech designers, as activists, as Wikipedia contributors in many different ways. So it's not the purpose of the report is not only to inform new research, which is great. It is we really hope to inspire other researchers, but it's an invitation for everybody to join from different perspectives, from different sectors, from different activities. There are very specific call to actions you will find there. So please go read and think if you can engage on one of those actions, or imagine your own and invite us to join your projects or activities related with language justice on the internet and Wikipedia.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good moment to wrap up. I shared the link of the report on the internet, on the state of the internet's languages, in the chat if you want to follow up. With that, I want to say a big thank you to the speakers today, to Jisung, Mariana, and Martin. Thanks for taking the time and sharing your work. And this is great work. Thanks again so much. I found it really, really interesting. I also want to thank everyone for attending and participating, or if you watch it later, thank you for that too. And also I want to thank for the support from Josh, our technical support here, and Emily and Diego for helping out here. And with that, I can already announce that in July will be the next research showcase about the winners of the Wikimedia Research Award of the year, the recipients. Both recipients will join us for a talk. And until then, before that, you can also join us in our monthly office hours. The next edition is, I think, on July 5th, if you want to chat with us. And with that, I wish you a very good rest of the day, wherever you are. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.